Fantastic. She says hi back.
All right.
All right, the live stream is starting.
Well, if we're going to do this, why don't I just take my notes and talk?
Won't that be
Something like
better?
that, yeah.
Well, he can't do all the talking.
No, I want you to.
Oh yeah, refresh his page. There should be something new now.
You know that the topic this year is violence, right? And the questions are,
Exactly.
is nature violent?
Yeah, exactly.
Or is it that human nature is violent? Well, that's a trick question because humans beings are part of nature, right?
Fantastic. Anything new?
So it's a complicated issue, and we've already looked at the Ajax of Sophocles, right?
No, I don't think that'll get us where we need to go.
That's set in an environment of war,
in the YouTube
right?
search
The
bar.
Great War, the Trojan War. And then we've got that as the background, and then Ajax, of course, is caught in a psychological dilemma. So he exerts violence on himself by committing suicide. And so what is the exact nature of human violence? And it's my belief that it's largely psychological. And this psychology exerts itself in the world in many different ways. And it's the root of, in my opinion, primary conflict in the world. Ideological conflict, personal conflict, all kinds of conflict. They result as a clash of ideas, ideals, and ideologies. And we've chosen three things to look at that kind of the issue of violence in society. And we start with the Sophocles, then we're doing Wagner's Ring, which you know, I think is an essay in violence. And it pits the kind of aggressive forced violence against the kind of benign violence that sometimes emerges even in a society that is run by law and order, presumably. And, you know, in The Ring, Wotan starts out with a good intention to control the world or bring order into the world, and it turns into the use of power or the abuse of power, which turns into violence. And it's a way of connecting the art with things that are happening in the world. And before Al starts to speak, I just want to say a few things about him. I met Dr. Felsenberg at a cocktail party in Palm Beach on New Year's Day. And it happened to have been at the home of Edwina Sands. And Edwina Sands is the granddaughter of Winston Churchill. And at that time, I had no idea that I would be talking about Churchill or that Al would be here talking to you. But I don't like cocktail parties in general at all. And I was told that there were going to be some very interesting people there. And the first person, practically the only person I talked to was Dr. Felsenberg. And I immediately liked him, and we had some very interesting conversation. It centered around basically academic situations that were going on. And then, a couple of years later, in Palm Beach, there was an exhibition of Churchill's artwork, and that was curated by Edwina Sands at the Four Arts in Palm Beach. And in that exhibition, above the paintings were these phrases from Churchill. And I was very inspired by that, and I had already made my decision to do the year's topic on violence. And I thought, wow, wouldn't this be a great idea to choose Winston Churchill as the artist that we would look at for the year, and also try to do something about Churchill and his amazing handling of the impending catastrophe, world catastrophe, and his instinct or his prescient knowledge that Hitler was going to do what he said he was going to do. It just wasn't political bluster. And I asked Dr. Felsenberg if he would come and talk about Churchill and the general political climate on which Hitler rose to power, and how it was that Churchill almost single-handedly brought this to world attention and led to the dismantling of that regime. Al has been on the Hill for about 10 years. He just finished working with the Commission on the Economic, help me out, Al.
The Joint Economic Committee.
Joint Economic Committee. He is
Last December.
author of 5 books, I think. The last one is on the life and relationship of William F. Buckley to the presidents. He's a marvelous writer, Al. And also, most importantly, I think, he was principal spokesperson for the 9/11 Commission. So he's an appropriate person to talk, a wonderful friend, and I hope that you'll enjoy and get to listen to what he has to say carefully. We're going to try to open it up at the very end with a few questions. So I think with too
Okay.
much
Thank you.
further ado.
Thank you for it. I said that it would be helpful if some of you had seen The Darkest Hour, because Churchill, the last line in the movie was, "What did he just do?" Halifax, who was the alternative to Churchill for the prime ministership when the British government collapsed, says, "What he just did was weaponize the English language." And in many ways, his motivating words is what helped his country survive and also get the help they needed. There aren't very many people who, I think, changed the course in history. There are big forces, economic forces, religious forces, the question of violence that you talk about. It's not always easy for the best of leaders to put the brakes on, to change direction. Churchill is one of the few. He happened to have the good luck of living in the same time as Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was another one I'll talk about. They were both very conscious of Lincoln's legacy and how Lincoln had done the same thing with language. We'll talk about that a little bit as I go. Churchill was a great student of speeches, and speeches that could move armies, maybe stop armies. So I think that's wonderful. But we saw the movie. Now we know how the story ended. We know that Britain survives at least long enough. It's all alone for a long time after that speech. I mean, we see Dunkirk go down. It was a very strategic retreat, and he had to, broke his heart to give up a whole division, knowing what was going to happen to his own men at the cost of getting the others out. All alone. And then we get the bombing that spring, the Battle of Britain in May of 1940, I'm sure. The most enduring memory that your grandparents probably have of being in Britain during the war. But we don't really understand all of what he went through when it began. His position was seen by most of the establishment, by the economists of the time, by the philosophers of the time, by the statesmen of the time, and even by those who had served in the previous World War, which he also had been part of, which we can talk about. His was the irrational position. They had just come out, about 18 years earlier, of what they thought was the most violent conflagration that ever hit mankind up to that point. I have a few statistics that I'll talk about, but all wars were so popular in the beginning. You've heard some of the recruiting songs for World War I. You know, after the collapse of Napoleon, the other powers of Europe got together and decided they have to find some way to stop these constant wars in Europe, and they did have the Conference of Vienna, and the peace stood for about a half century until the nation state becomes paramount, right? Germany Germany becomes a country, it's supposed all these duchies. Italy becomes united. And all these nation states are supposed to keep the peace, balance, power, right? You read about this. And the conflagration starts when the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Ferdinand, is killed by a Serbian national who wants to secede from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I'm not going to go through the whole war. Serbia is backed by Russia. Other countries are backed by France. Britain is tied to France, and the whole world blows up, and nobody expects this to happen. And in a wonderful book called The Guns of August, which John Kennedy had his cabinet read during the missile crisis, how one misstep, how do you demobilize the huge army, clunk, 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 and the whole world could have, and almost did, was destroyed. Well, in that war, any of you watched Downton Abbey? The PBS? Well, it's very significant. The code of chivalry was very, very much in practice at that time. The leading lights of their generation, I'm talking about the dukes and the earls and even the great physicians, and poets and writers, they couldn't wait to sign up. I mean, this was the code of chivalry. This is the time that officers preceded their troops into battle. We didn't have any armchair generals. And they wind up trying to sell Downton Abbey at the end because so many of these young people had perished. Who was going to run the great estates? An entire generation of leadership was rubbed out. If I took you to Berlin or Paris or London, 1930, there would be a tremendous shortage of middle-aged men. You would see old people and you would see fatherless children to a large degree. It wiped out not only a generation, but the best of the generation. Left them traumatized. There's no other word for it. But I said, you know, the war, all wars, they start out, when the Civil War started out, the senators and congressmen would take their families on picnics to Manassas, which you know is a battlefield now. And they were going to watch the Confederate Army whooped in like 35 minutes. Well, of course, 35 minutes turned out to be almost 5 years. They start, if you saw the movie Gone with the Wind, you see all these Confederate guys yelling and screaming and can't wait to, blow the Yankees' heads off. And of course it ends with tremendous carnage and even a worse situation than before. Think of the recruiting poster. It's still recruiting posters for World War I. They commissioned some of the greatest artists in the country to do them. There's a father sitting in an easy chair with the son. Well, Daddy, what did you do during the war? As a way of saying you're going to be sorry if you don't sign up. The Brits went all out when they start trying to recruit Irish farm boys who were trying to fight their own independence from Britain to begin with. They come up with a recruiting song, Long Way to Tipperary. I knew I was going to get music in here. In New York, we had this fellow named George M. Cohan. He came up with this over there, right? Johnny, get your gun, get your gun, get your gun, take it on the run. And then the melody, that's the run-up. The melody is, it has the line, the melody is in the chants of a bugle. Over there, send the word, send the word. That's what they were doing. And it was like carnival time. I mean, they would get actors and actresses and sports figures to go into movie theaters before the show would start and recruit people, sell bombs. The entire civilian population was mobilized for the first time, probably since Napoleon. Much better than Napoleon. They had more high tech, unfortunately, available to them. It doesn't end that way. It turns out to be the first high-tech war. Gas was used, poison gas was used. Words like Geneva Accords, words like war crimes finally entered into the English language for the first time. Some statistics. Numbers are always hard things, but 40 million people perished in World War I, half of them civilian population through starvation and other acts of cruelty, sometimes of Jews, sometimes not. The figures for Britain are interesting because they count in much of the empire. So we're talking about Britain, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and some of the others. 1 million people died, dead, just military deaths. France, 1 million. Germany, 2 million. Now, the United States, a little bit about the United States. And we got into the war in April of 1917, and the war ends in November of 18, the Armistice Day, which you've just been through. 116,516 soldiers perished. Now, much less than what I read about the other countries, but think about this. We were only in a year and a half, 116,000. We were in Vietnam for 7 years, 58,000. That was enough to tear this country apart. If you've read about the Vietnam War and the demonstrations that happened here. We came in at the end. There was this novel that everyone read, and a pacifist novel comes out of failed wars and unpopular wars. The one for this one was All Is Quiet on the Western Front. All right, it talks about French young men and young Germans losing 50,000 in a battle over a year in Vietnam for what? 6 inches of territory. It was a pacifist novel. It was the novel of the 1930s. Often read and promulgated by veterans of that war. Never again, never again. Also, we had one of the worst pandemics in the history of mankind. You know it as the flu epidemic, the great influenza. Sadly misnamed, called the Spanish flu. And it was called the Spanish flu. The Spanish had nothing to do with it. They were a neutral power, and they didn't have censorship. So we found out that we were sending infected troops to the front. So in terms of just the United States, 63,000 of those 116,000 did not die of bullet wounds. They died of this very infectious flu. So an extraordinary toll. Now, but a 4 million man American army was enough at the end to break through the Western Front and actually force the armistice, which we just have been through, and the war ends. Well, this is the great traumatization that Churchill is going through. So we look at appeasement. You know, every parent tells their child that don't be bullied in the schoolyard. You have 2 choices. You know, you can run away from the bully, and maybe he'll leave you alone. The odds are he'll pick on you more. Or you can confront the bully, and maybe you at least get a standoff, but he's not going to go away. They came to the view that what I just told you is irrational. The worst thing to have is a repeat of what they were through. And when you look at the what the war settled, it didn't really settle very much. It starts out as a war for colonies, and it continues that in different ways. Germany is vanquished, and Germany is given a very vindictive feast. Now that was not unusual, because 50 years earlier, when Germany and France went out at the previous time, France was vanquished. We heard about Alsace-Lorraine, and it was yanked by Germany. This became a source of grievances, so now, of course, vengeance is instructed. And so when Hitler is making these demands on writing what he exploited as a wrong of the treaty, a lot of people were willing to listen, or a lot of people were willing to buy him off. And a lot of people were willing to blind themselves, given what they had been through. Self-deception, self-hypnosis, if you want. Now, within British society, the upper classes that I told you about, that had been so chivalrous the previous time, become the lead isolationists, the lead appeasers. We've been there, we know it, and this isn't going to happen. Now, they call them the Cliveden set, and they formed an interesting intellectual and social circle around Lady Astor, one of the famous British families. And she had a house in Buckinghamshire, which is for what we named it Cliveden. It was the palace. And she had extravagant parties, and they were attended by all the anyone who wanted to be anyone in British society. Young John Kennedy and his sisters and brother went a lot. The father was the ambassador from the United States to the UK. And a lot of this was social, a lot of this was a think tank. And self-deception. Hitler's going to win this war anyway. He's mobilized, he's got the armies going, he's got the factories moving, he's managed to, through force or just by illegal action, violate all of the sanctions of the Versailles Treaty. And you know, we've been sitting around not doing very much. We haven't been turning out the planes. We haven't been doing the heavy machinery. Maybe we can make a deal with him. This becomes the ideology. And they come up with the term appeasement. And then you have this guy, Winston Churchill. Now, there's a lot of great things you can and say about Winston Churchill. But what they all knew about Winston Churchill were his defects. You know, if you read The Gathering Storm, I mean, he wrote a 6-volume memoir of World War II. I think the best volume is the first volume because he is extremely self-critical. And he dissects all of his defects. And he had a hell of a lot of defects. It makes me wonder if I had not put the word Winston Churchill in, and I read you his resume, and I read you the things he was involved in, whether you would follow this man up the hill. All right? Most rational people said, no way. Well, he was a great advocate of the British Empire. None of the colonies are going to go. And he spends a good part of the 1930s in various battles with Mahatma Gandhi and others from other colonies, non-white native peoples who want to break away from Britain, or if not break away, at least have some bit of home rule. And he's always on the other side. And you know, the things he says about these folks, you would you're not very happy about. In the previous war, as a matter of honor, you know, he led what's called the Admiralty, which is basically the Naval Department. He was a tremendous advocate of the Navy. And it turned out that they planned a disastrous campaign in Gallipoli. And as a civilian cabinet officer, he takes the hit for it rather than let the admirals get court-martialed. You know, it's my responsibility. You know, Harry Truman used to say the buck stops here. He said, well, it stops with me. I'm responsible for it. He gets in. He's a bit of a romantic. Like he's a bit of a Victorian, well into the Edwardian era and beyond. Loves a good story. Loves a good romance. He's absolutely enchanted with Edward VII and his divorced American commoner wife, Wallace Simpson. And he directs and supports the king, who's about to go out and go down. But if you're going to go out, you're going to go out with a memorable line. This is Churchill in the English language again. So you're just not going to go out because you're a jerk and you don't understand duty and obligation and why the British people won't accept this woman, blah, 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 blah. You're going out because you're giving up the throne for the woman you love. Right? You're giving up the throne. You can't be king without, this is the Churchill line. He gave the king. He'll go out with some dignity, right? And so I cannot take this this hardship. I can't be a figurehead, real backbreaking job, without the sustained support of the woman I love. So he got one honorable line, and then he waits 5 minutes, and he's back at the palace and saying, well, you know, I come with the drapes. And I guess the younger brother, George, have you seen the King's speech? Yes. So the younger brother, having just written the farewell address for the failed king, I'm now going to write the, hey, how are you, for the stuttering king. So great support for the royal family, whoever it is. I mean, Alice in Wonderland, he writes a coronation speech for her. Okay. He changed parties 2 times. Right? He was not considered a team player, all right? And not just changed parties a few times. I mean, I used to be a member of a political party until last week. Okay, we had the election, no longer. But anyway, he has to change parties with a Sousa band crossing the floor with great dramatics and all of his friends and neighbors. And then, of course, the problem is when he changes back, it gets even more complicated. So he's not somebody that they thought was very stable. Okay? Now, something personal, which something we like about him, I like about him. there was something about British society that he did not fit in with. When you read about Franklin Roosevelt, you'll see that here's this man who wants to regulate Wall Street, and here's this man that wants to tax business and is trying to come up with a basic entitlement reform for poor people and have a social safety net. The kind of thing Bismarck did in the 1870s, nobody thought he was progressive. Okay, that Roosevelt doesn't do it until 1932, but this is communism. I mean, you have to understand the American idiom a little bit. So he gets tagged as a traitor to his class. Okay, there's a little bit of this in Churchill, and it's because, you'll pardon me, because it's the British class system. Now, this is the same thing that made George Washington the first American. What do we mean the first American? I mean, there were people living here. What do we mean the first American?
The head of the newly...
No. Nothing to do with being president. We didn't have a country yet. But if we were to describe ourselves to the world, let's just say pre-Trump anyway, what would we say about America? What are we proud of? In our best, we have a lot of things are in our best. In our best, what do we think we're proud of?
Self-made.
Yeah, well, not just that. Yes, you got it. Not just self-made. I mean, you can be born rich and do great things. You can be born rich and be an alcoholic professionally, right? And go out with the best malts and all that, and, you know, make it to 35. But no, it's that your talents are recognized. That talent will get you somewhere. Maybe not just wealth and family and position, but the fact you have something to contribute, and that's going to be recognized. Well, George Washington is a great thing for the crown. He shows them how to fight a guerrilla war against the French and the other. And the French are figuring out that if they wear camouflage and they befriend Native Americans, that they might be able to get the British Army out of North America. And of course, the British Army, they'd show up with their lobster red uniforms, pardon me, right? And their drum and fife car, right? And they show up in the middle of this field in Virginia, and their enemy, Native Americans and Frenchmen, are all wearing camouflage, waiting, "Yoo-hoo, we're here!" And then they start the drum and fife corps, and their heads get blown up. Washington teaches the Continentals how to fight this kind of a battle. And he's graciously thanked by the king, personally. Washington was probably the only American besides Ben Franklin the king ever heard of. And here's this 25-year-old kid who came up with this. And he says, "Thank you very much, and you don't get your lifetime ambition. You don't get a commission in the British Army because you're nothing but a continental." Really? Well, I'm on the other side. You know, I hear you're raising taxes, and people are throwing tea in Boston, and I'll have 2 lumps of sugar, please, and that's the end of that. And he becomes an American, the first American, because the class system did not reward what he thought it should do. Well, in Britain, well, actually, the same system, but compare Washington and Churchill for a minute. Churchill was, well, here's how we do this. You had a war, the World War. We always seem to have them. We're always going to have a war to end world wars. Then we have one with Louis XIV, and the Brits win in the Battle of Blenheim, and Queen Anne commissions the greatest architect in England, Van Brun, to build the palace and give it to the first Virgin. He gets the title, and the title and the land go down to the oldest son. So the younger sons either wind up going into the clergy, or they become soldiers, and the whole place starts again. So this thing, have anybody been to Washington's mansion at Mount Vernon? And you know that that was not his house, it was his half-brother's house. Washington was the oldest son of a second marriage. He had no choice but to be a soldier.
Yeah.
Right? He gets real lucky because he has 2 half-brothers ahead of him who deceased. And that's how he gets the house. So Churchill is born at Blenheim, okay, because his father is also a younger son, and the title, it was still a, what Duke of, what do they call the, there were lots of Churchills who hosted Trump in the last, but they're not the direct line of Churchill. He's born there because because his father is visiting the grandparents and the older brother. And his mother goes into labor, so he gets born in Blenheim. That's not his palace. So he's a little bit, he figures a little bit on the outs. He's got to support himself some way. He also goes into the army. His mother is well connected in London with the publishing world and with the King's friends and everything else, so he gets to write journalism of his own exploits as a soldier. He writes his memoirs at a very early age, but he's got to support himself, number one. Other aspects of that class system bother him greatly. He is a smart man. He will educate himself. He's one of the few of the British prime ministers of his time not to have gone to university. He goes right into military school, Sandhurst, which is their West Point, and he goes into battle, trying to make a reputation for himself. Now, the Cliveden set, what I'm talking about. First of all, the link between Britain and Germany was very, very strong. I mean, the British royal family is Battenberg. They changed the name to Windsor because nobody wanted to be German, fighting the Germans. It's very complicated. So she becomes Mrs. Windsor, current Queen, Carrie. It's really, Mrs. Battenberg. In any event, thanks to Queen Victoria and Albert, what do they have? 10 children, and they all intermarry into other royal families, spread hemophilia across Europe, and we got Rasputin and Lenin, and you get the whole deal, So you don't have to major in history. You don't have to major in history. But they said, we're Germans. This is the Cliveden set. Lady Asker's friends. We can get a deal with Hitler, right? We're the same race. We're Aryans. Why don't we just make a deal? We become not a vassal, but we at least become an ally or a neutral. We stop an invasion. We prevent the bombing. Well, we'll have to figure out what we're going to do with the Jews, but that's not very important after all. We're not Jewish, right? So we've got to deal with them. And he begins to think about it. He says, maybe you can. Maybe you can cut a deal with them. You'll do fine. But the ordinary person in Britain is not going to do fine. This is where they're going to get their slave labor, just like they have in Germany. Their life's going to be ordered and regimented. You're going to have a great time like you're having now. That's going to basically destroy all the things we love about this country. The ordinary people will be subjugated. And I have to think about this very hard. Well, pause. Lincoln had the same deal, same dilemma. Now, of course, there's a movie about this too, thanks to Mr. Spielberg. But there's a scene where, I'm not getting too much into the United States now, but when Lincoln was born, nobody thought you could end slavery in this country. It was protected by the Constitution. Clear. The big fight was kind of the extended areas that weren't part of this nation when the revolution was fought, but it was clearly protected. We have the 3/5 clause. We're giving out congressmen, representatives. The great irony that they're counted for representation, but they don't have any say in picking the representatives. This is a way of padding the number of votes to be sure you can amend the Constitution to get rid of slavery. But okay, I'm not doing it. But Lincoln has an opportunity. It says in the Constitution that in times of domestic insurrection, the president can confiscate property, enemy property, to weaken the enemy's capacity to fight war. Well, he maintained that these 20% of the United States of the population that was enslaved were human beings. The South says they're property. He said, okay, fine, I'll tip my hat to you. They're property. Good, I can confiscate it, I can shove them into the Union Army, I can give them a rifle, they can blow their master's head off. Wonderful. I wish a lamb could fight as strongly, And so he uses that. And that's the vehicle for the Emancipation Proclamation. He never thought when he was growing up, he hated slavery all his life, he never thought he'd have that coincidental event. It happened. Problem is the war is won now, almost won. And the South asks for peace. And their terms are, that we just forget this happened. We just go back to where we were in 1860. And he says, you know, I can prevent what you will know as Sherman's March to the Sea. I can prevent maybe another 200,000 to 300,000 casualties. We now think about 1 million people perished militarily in the war. We used to say 600,000. I can prevent all of that. He said, you know, I had this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I'd be damned in eternity if I sell some of our best soldiers back into bondage. I can't do it. And then he asked to speak to the, well, President's Review troops. I mean, the current president can't be bothered to try 10 minutes to pay homage yesterday, but Lincoln would stand for hours in the rain, and he reviewed troop after troop after troop, and he stops with the 166th Regiment of Ohio. And he says something like, what is this all about? And what this is about is you're looking at somebody who temporarily lives in this big house called the White House. This is all about your right and your children's right to aspire to live where I live right now, just like my father's son was living here, came from nothing. You have that right. This country is worth preserving. It's not just about slaves. It's about you. Are we going to go back to a system where you don't count again? Or are you going to fight this to the end? Well, Churchill knew his Lincoln. He read constantly. And I said he did not go to university. He was what you would call a late bloomer. He had spottiness in his education. He tried to teach himself science and finally hired the best scientist. He finally figured that was easier. And he listened to him, right? But on speeches and on history and on the things we're talking about. So he's trying to make that point that the ordinary Brit is going to be sold into slavery if they take that deal. Secondly, he didn't believe Hitler. He said, well, I look out at the Dutch. They look pretty white too, pretty Aryan too. He gave them a 24-hour demand that they let down their arms in 24 hours. They accept it. They surrender. The second hour, he levels Rotterdam. I don't remember how many civilians are murdered now. So, well, how do you know he's going to keep the deal once you do that? So here's the greatness of him. He said, all right, I'm going to resist this. And I see Chamberlain is about to fall. And I see this is all going to fall apart in front of us. What do I get if I win? Well, at the very best, he knows in another world war, the odds are not very strong that Britain is going to come out a superpower that it was going in, right? So he rejects the idea of being a vassal of Germany. But he says, you know, our only chance of keeping democracy alive is to make some kind of a plea to the Americans. You'll hear this over and over again in his speeches. There's always a notion if we go down, the other English-speaking peoples are going to come to our rescue this one time. And maybe not a vassal of America, but maybe at the most, we could be part of a collective security that keep the peace among democratic nations. The kind of things you're seeing our president attacking at the moment, all right? Have a common market that make Germans and French economically independent on each other, so we don't do this every day. So while Trump was doing his thing in Europe the other day, you saw these pictures of Merkel and Macron, almost a love fest. I mean, they've heard from their grandparents, their grandparents heard it from their grandparents. We brought an end to this for 80 years. The only one person in the world doesn't get it, but okay, we'll deal with that. He says, well, so I'm going to come out of all this sacrifice, all this blood, sweat, toil, tears. It's going to be, I'm going to have to be a partner to somebody, and I'm going to have to do it the way I just described. Yeah. So I said, Lincoln says this country is worth protecting for the soldiers to aspire and their children to aspire to be in the same house that I'm in now, born on a dirt floor, and my father only could read one thing, his own signature. An illiterate farmer that's at least the aspiration. The aspiration doesn't mean you get it, but you can be president. Well, he would ask his mother to send him books. Yes, there was a great deal of fighting while he was in the Boer War and other places. There was also a lot of downtime. And he asked her to send all these Latin books. He never finished what he was sending him in other places. Of course, he always traveled with Shakespeare and read about all the British kings. Which, the royal family was very personal to him. I just mentioned the two brothers. I write for anybody who's in the palace. Okay. And Richard II is this great passage. So you know it. What is this thing we're fighting for? What is this? Well, Lincoln told them what it was. This country is worth preserving. So what do we have that's worth preserving? This royal throne of kings, this sceptered isle, this earth of majesty, the seat of Mars, this other Eden, demi-paradise, this fortress built by nature for herself, against infection and the hand of war. Interesting isolation island. Cut off from all these bad things. This happy breed of man, this little world, this precious stone set in the silver sea, which serves it in the office or as a most offensive to a house, against the envy of less happier lands. This blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England. Well, every speech from every great leader has to have a few points to it. It has to lead to a certain peroration, a certain objective of what all these words are for, what they're going to. It has multiple audiences. If you listen to John Kennedy's speech during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he's got like 5 audiences at once. He's got the American people, right? Are we going to have a nuclear war? What did we find? What are we doing? He has the Soviet Union. He has to tell them that an attack on any of our allies or any nation in this hemisphere or in Europe is a direct attack on the Soviet Union on the people of the United States that will be responded to. He has to tell the Cuban people, because he's still hoping that there will be a rebellion against Castro at the time, that this isn't a war against them. He calls Cuba in the speech just a slave island. So we got 3 or 4 publics going on, in a 12-minute speech. Well, he gives this speech, and he's obviously telling it to the British people, and he's telling it to the world, but his real audience is Franklin Roosevelt, who I talked about a minute ago. You got to hold on long enough. I don't want to criticize the movie in a minute, but I will. All right. But the peroration, which is his most famous speech ever. We shall go into first of all, and you have to tell the public the truth. If you really want to be a persuasive leader, maybe a persuasive conductor, anything, you got to tell your audience the truth. We're doing well or we're not doing well. We have to improve here, we have to improve there. Don't say everything is perfect. Life through rose-colored glasses. He's promising them tremendous devastation, tremendous sacrifice, tremendous death. This is not a carnival. But he's trying to tell them why it's worth it in the end. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and the oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. And that's what he's really thinking about. And if, which I do not for a moment believe, this island, or a large part of it, were subjugated and starving, that our empire beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British fleet, will carry on the struggle until, in God's good time, hello, Franklin, the new world, with all its power and might, steps forth to the rescue and liberation of the old. Okay? That's the constituency. And he knows that he is basically becoming a, shall we say, a secondary power as a lesser evil, but maybe a better good than to listen to the Cliveden set. Now, what I didn't like about the movie is I could have fixed the movie with one caption card, one index card. Because you've got the scene at Dunkirk, and you see the Roosevelt calls, or he calls Roosevelt, and he's practically begging him for help, okay? And I was watching it on the way home. A Canadian friend said to me, well, why didn't you give him help? As if it was all up Roosevelt. So I was trying to explain to him, thank you, they could have done this in one card. What was going on in the United States? Well, Franklin Roosevelt had the same problems that Lindbergh had. We had a failed World War with a very weak or misguided leader at the time. Woodrow Wilson just didn't believe in fighting wars to obtain objectives. He's going to have to make this the war to end wars and nation building and all this kind of stuff. And we know how that played out. But the answer the lady asked her over here was a fellow named Charles Lindbergh. Much more famous, much more popular. He was the famous aviator in the 1920s, son of an isolationist congressman. Spirit of St. Louis. He was young, he was charismatic, he was very dynamic. He married one of the great heiresses of the world, Anne Morrow Lindbergh, a great writer in her own sense. And he starts a group called America First. And again, there are people, some of them were socialists and pacifists, some of them were Nazi sympathizers, maybe even security risks. They all believed in one thing, that it's none of our business. We bailed out their chestnuts last time. We ain't going. And so what's happening in the end of that film is he's getting ready for the bombardment. He's begging Roosevelt to help him. Roosevelt, being very politically savvy, knows that popular opinion is not completely ready yet. Gallup polling was in its infancy. Gallup was around, and they showed that 14% of the public thought the Great War was a good idea. 37% thought it was a mistake. He's trying to run for re-election. He's fearful that an isolationist candidate will make the war a referendum, and he will lose the referendum. He might even think Lindbergh may be nominated, but he knows that the leading Republican candidates are all against helping Britain. So he's playing for time. The Republican convention convenes just as France is falling. Public opinion is now beginning to change. You're now watching German armies goose-stepping through various villages and people panicking, and things are changing a little bit. The press barons decide that the British have a strong case to make. And they wound up nominating a person no one ever heard of before. His name is Wendell Willkie. And he agrees with Franklin Roosevelt that we have to give Britain the arms, and they fight the election down on something else. So the war is now taken off the agenda. And both parties, or at least both candidates, not both parties, both candidates, have a certain sense. Now, he also knows that we're saying that the oceans will protect us, right? We've been able to survive without invasion, and had we not gone into World War I, we probably would not have been invaded by the Kaiser. My last point. So he makes this speech the end of 1940. So Churchill literally is on his own for 6 months. We're going from May to December. And December, he gives a speech called The Arsenal of Democracy. Now again, his audience, he knows the country is not dying to get into war. He comes up with the excuse, the way to keep us out of war is to see that Britain survives. In the worst case, which I don't expect for a minute, it's like Churchill says, we have to go to war, we need a place to invade from. Where we're going to go from? Indiana to Normandy? So they have to stay alive for that, but I don't expect that. We can prevent it. And he says the following. If Great Britain goes down, the Axis powers will control the continent of Europe, Asia, Africa, Australia, and the high seas. They'll be in a position to bring enormous military and naval resources against this hemisphere. It's no exaggeration to say that all of us in all of the Americas will be living at the point of a gun. A gun loaded with explosive bullets, economic as well as military. We shall enter upon a new and terrible era in which the whole world, our hemisphere included, will be run by threats of brute force. And to survive in such a world, we'll have to convert ourselves permanently into a militaristic power on the basis of a war economy. Now, he's basically saying these British bases go down, British Navy goes down, how safe will you feel if the German Navy starts patrolling the Atlantic? So we're not such an isolated nation after all. We were interdependent. The same argument Churchill was making. He's got the message. Why don't I stop here and see what kind of response you have and questions. Before I do, reading. Okay, what kind of things in your spare time could you read about that tell you about that period and this one? Well, I mentioned All's Quiet on the Western Front, which gives you the pacifist view. There's a woman named Lynn Olson who has written several books on Britain and America in the 30s. Darkest Days is about the Lindbergh-Roosevelt duel. There's one called Troubled Young Men, which is about the group of young people that decide Winnie's the guy. Winnie is the horse to bet on. They're backbenchers in Parliament. They're not the older Clive Set. They're younger people that see this old guy's right and they're very fearful of Nazis. Robert Graves wrote two wonderful books. One's called The Long Weekend, which tells you about life at Clive Set and what British life is like. The other is Goodbye to All That, which is life in the trenches, from one of these very wealthy officers' point of view, and it brings all the divisions of British society into the battlefield, and you get a real feel for that. Just a little bit of a smattering. As they pointed out this week, World War I is a very understudied and under-celebrated war. That's because of all the waste and carnage. So I would add, John Maynard Keynes we think of as an economist, but he wrote a book called The Economic Consequences of the Peace. He was a 23-year-old fellow, an Oxford student, wound up to a family friend attached to the British delegation at Versailles. He wrote in everything he saw. And if you ever wanted an essay in failed statesmanship, the best thing I've read, about 200 pages. Very readable. Okay. Questions, comments, reactions? Maybe you can talk about anything you like. Or ask me anything you like.
Why Lindbergh? And what did his group of followers actually do?
I'll tell you.
Okay. It's kind of random.
No,
He was more like a celebrity than.
No. He was more dangerous than that.
Yeah.
No.
But he wasn't really a political figure.
Well, he became one.
Yeah.
Okay, first of all, you want to go into politics, you get name recognition.
True.
Right? You want two things. You want to run for Congress. Okay? Name recognition gets you press, and you also need money. Okay? Lindbergh was a 25-year-old farm boy. He was the Steve Jobs of the 1920s. He answers an ad. About anyone willing to risk flying nonstop from New York to Paris. Nonstop. I think the prize money must have been $200,000 in 1927. So he becomes the Steve Jobs of his age. He builds this aircraft in his father's garage, literally. Then he moves the whole shebang out to Roosevelt Field, which has eventually become LaGuardia Airport, and he does it. And of course, he comes home to ticker tape parade, marries his heiress. All these great things happen, but he knows a hell of a lot about aviation. I mean, there aren't too many airports before this happens. There's a lot about aviation. There's a lot about technology. And he's, in sentiment, pro-German, very defeatist. And he's a somewhat celebrity. Okay. I don't want to say what does Donald Trump know about politics, but he is president. And he's president because people heard of him. He understood how to manipulate the media. And we can leave the rest out. I have firmer opinions. We'll leave that alone. But let's go back to Lindbergh. He starts saying that, first of all, every third American boy be mowed down to go to Europe. They're going to defeat us. They have the largest army in the world, the largest this in the world, the largest that in the world. So he starts spreading defeatism. He goes to Germany, he picks up an award from the German High Command for his aviation techniques. He's now a star in Germany. There is a coalition, I mentioned, a coalition of people against the war. He becomes their spokesman. The reason he's relevant now is because he calls his organization America First. He's talking about America First now. And he gives a very nasty speech. You want to talk about Charlottesville and Pittsburgh and some other things? It's a very nasty speech saying that there are 3 groups in the United States that are determined to seduce America away from its natural instincts. Okay, one group is the Roosevelt administration, because they're all communists anyway. So you know they're redistributing income. The second group are the British government. Well, we can't blame them because they want help somewhere. We've got all the money, so okay, so they're acting out of their interests. Third group are the Jews. Okay? Jews have too much power in this country. He says this in 1938, 39, 40, 41, in a public speech broadcast around the country. You have some very pro-German Bund groups that are under surveillance by the FBI. They rent out Madison Square Garden. They've got crossed flags, Nazi flag and the American flag. Adolf Hitler next to George Washington. George doesn't look very much at home, let's say. But that's what was going on. And he says that he's sorry the Jews are persecuted, but blame the victim. They bring it on themselves because they're so visible in the media and they're so visible in this and that. They don't know their own place. And there's some question about their cosmopolitanism make them more loyal to other Jews and to other Americans. He's saying this.
And is that basically the same as what, I'm just curious,
Yeah.
what Hitler was saying about Jewish people during the 1930s? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the czars before that, and the medieval popes before that, and okay, we can go. You know, I mean, right. Right.
Yeah.
Well, what's going on now? We have this fellow Bannon. Let me tell you about me for a minute. The most inspiring speech I ever heard in person. There were others, but when Mrs. Thatcher left office, she came to Washington, where she got a probably bigger crowd she would have gotten in London at that time. Anyway, she said that the United States does not realize the gift it gave the world. She said other countries have split off from other countries. It's not new, you were independent. What's new was that you came up with this creed. And you said to be an American, all you had to do was subscribe to a creed that said we're all equal in the eyes of each other, in the eyes of the law, in the eyes of God, and anyone who says it could be an American. She said we are all the products of conquest, right, of genetics, of tribe, of warfare, of blood. Then we have this fellow named Steve Bannon, who is a former advisor to Trump. He's going around saying this now. Said it at Charlottesville, said it in a recent interview that we have to build our own American nation. What do you mean, all these pluralistic people here? We should be one like the Belgians are, one like the Poles are, and all of that. It was appalling to me. And what you have now is, in the name of populism, we could argue what that is, and this and that, you have this rising up in Eastern Europe. You know, Churchill's other great speech was the Iron Curtain speech, right? And now, of course, these people are trying to crawl, they're not under the Iron Curtain again, but to recreate the Iron Curtain again under a Putin regime of God knows what. I always thought communism and fascism were sort of opposites, but you know, Putin has gone from KGB now to Mr. Pro-Fascist Europe and everything else. Weakening of alliances, that's what Hitler did. You know, you create violence where none exists. We try to create group against group, division against division, until somebody says we've had enough of this chaos, we should have a strong man. And did I answer you? I mean, but Lindbergh was a big deal in his time. Every American child, mostly males, but a lot of women too. Amelia Earhart was stimulated to go into aviation because of him. He was on the cover of Popular Mechanics probably more than any human being. Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, I mean, you name it. I mean, he was the wholesome American kid and all of that, and the American dream coming true. And he knew his aviation, at least people thought he did.
Yeah.
So when he would say that the German Air Force is superior to all others, who was going to say you're lying? Well, he was lying. Okay, but then Pearl Harbor happens and first go away, and you know the rest of it. But he was quite powerful.
Yeah, I can see that.
Now, he had some other issues in his life. You had this horrible case of Lindbergh kidnapping in the 1930s. And first of all, he was your first paparazzi. What do you call it?
Paparazzi.
Thank you. The first paparazzi celebrity. He could not go into a bakery without all the flashbulbs going on.
Poor thing.
And he lived in a place, Flemington, New Jersey. And one night, a child of his is kidnapped, and then ransomed, and then the baby is found dead. And wherever Lindbergh goes, this horror. So they go to Europe for about 5 years. A lot of people think that had the kidnapping not happened, he would have run for president. But that his wife was traumatized over the baby's death, of course. And the last thing they needed was, Philip Roth, add to your reading list. He wrote a book called Plot Against America. And the plot is very simple. Lindbergh does run in 1940. And he gets nominated. So now we have the referendum on the war. And Lindbergh beats Roosevelt. What happens? The United States is now a neutral country between the Japanese Empire and the German Empire. Hitler eventually moved his capital to Colorado or something like this to run the world. Jews are not killed. They're sent to relocation centers. But Japanese Americans are not interned. And we become kind of a Vichy America, very heavily regimented and Nazified. Well, good chance without kidnapping. Very good chance that may have happened. So we thank God for Wendell Willkie that understood the Nazi threat. Okay, so that's who he was, and why he was a force. Anybody else have anything you want to talk about? You probably thought about some of these issues as much as I have. We're living in the world they created.
Yes, I'd be interested in just like hearing you, without opening can of worms, like hearing you elaborate maybe a little bit on how much you think this reflects like what's going on now.
Well, obviously,
because you mentioned it a little bit.
Well, obviously, I'm very worried about it. I mean, we put together this system, this intricate economic system and political system, and interdependency, with a hope that we wouldn't have the kind of carnage we had. And we have a leader of a country that came up with this, pretty much. Unraveling it, I can't understand the motive. I mean, when I was small, when John Kennedy went off to Berlin, he had some interesting comments to make. And he said, you know, ich bin ein Berliner, which is everybody's arguing about his German, right? I'm a jelly donut. All right. But they got it. They got it. When the war ended, Stalin decided that he was going to starve Berlin out, that he was going to deny passage of roads, block the roads. And Berlin is now part of East Germany, which means it's going to be run by Moscow, and you're leaving. We had a president named Harry Truman, said in a pig's eye, we'll let me get out. And I don't know how much it cost us, but every single day, from other parts of Europe, and sometimes from the United States, we sent planes in every single day. We didn't drop bombs. We dropped toys, groceries, medicine, clothes, food. Every single day. In 1948. And Kennedy goes like a dozen or more years later. Well, they remembered that. They remembered that. They took the same bet that Churchill took. They really want to be with the Americans. To such a degree that they were willing to take, as Kennedy said, when the history of these times are told, they will say the people of Berlin are in the front lines. They were. If you're going to have a Cold War, which I don't recommend, we may have one in China now, pardon me, They say we might. I don't think we will, nevertheless. Well, I don't have a Cold War with you. No. But when you're going to have a Cold War, and you're going to have missiles from Colorado pointed at Moscow, you know, and you're going to have missiles in Moscow pointed at New York. I mean, who's in the middle? Well, it's called Europe. I mean, they were willing to take that hit because of what we did for them, keep them free. Soviets were not fooling around. It's easy to go back and say, well, you know, wasn't that bad? Cold War was pretty bad. It wasn't existential. The one thing your generation does not have is what we used to have air raid drills, right? Go to the basement of the school, put your hands against your neck, lean toward the locker, and wait for the whole building to fall on you. Basically, called civilian defense. But we were terrified. We were terrified. We had these air raid drills. We had all these sirens for no reason. All this was going on all the time. And so he says they're not paying for their own defense. I mean, against who? Well, they want our bases. I mean, so he's saying that they're not paying for their defense. They have better health care and better infrastructure. Well, he's had a just have an infrastructure bill. He's going on and on. So that's my comment. On NATO, that's particularly what I'm talking about. On trade, now, it gets to Macron's speech, where he said that you know, patriotism is more than just your own selfish interest. So Trump had a, by the way, this is not just my spin, because I'm trying to be somewhat objective. He had a meeting with Merkel, and he says to her, you know, what do you need this trade bloc for? I mean, I'll give you a better deal, 2% less. Why do you give a damn about the Danes? Well, the answer is, you know, we have a trading bloc, and I'm not in it for myself. I mean, a lot of greater minds than mine, Mr. President, came up with this idea. Names you won't remember anymore, but Adenauer, Monet, de Gaulle, those people came up with this idea. And they were occupied by the Nazis for a very, very long time. The smaller nations were very badly treated, and I'm now their leader. I'm now the leader for a year or whatever. They keep rotating chairman of the EU. And it's not about Germany. It's about Europe. It's about alliances. Well, he's mad at her because he could make a better deal of 2% less, and why is she turning it down? She's irrational, she's dumb, she's stupid, low IQ. Yeah, that's how I feel about it, and I think it's disgraceful. Should they pay more for their defense? Maybe, probably. But the way to do that is not to disrupt an alliance and make America the bully and forgetting all the things we derive out of it. I mean, anyway, that's my. Yeah. Anyone else? Or how are we doing on time?
We've got plenty after 45 minutes left.
All right. So, what do you want to do? I can just keep talking to be relevant to it.
No, you can keep talking. No one else has questions? You mentioned last night the book about, the short book on fascism.
Yes.
What-
Yes.
And
Actually, I'm having my students at Penn read it over Thanksgiving because it's 200 pages. By the time you get through customs, you'll have it read. It's called it's called How Fascism Works. It's by a Yale professor called Jason Stanley. It talks about what I'm talking about. How well Putin does this all the time. How you disrupt other people's elections, right? How you hack into their system. How you change the narrative, right? Why is it when you channel surf? Why do all of the same networks, well, leave Fox aside, why do most of the networks think the same thing as news? I mean, why does it never change? Why does the storyline never change from CBS to NBC to MSNBC to CNN? Is there anything else going on in the world except the Broward County recount? I mean, do the 49 other states really care if the governor of Florida is? I can understand it when we're talking about a president. And we had the Bush-Gore recount for for 5, 6 weeks. And that recount, everybody, the other 49 states wanted to know who their president is. I don't think the other 49 states care who the California governor or senator, Florida senator is. But why do they decide Broward County? Well, because their producers decide. And they decide because they read other things and everybody else has decided. They don't want to be left out. Well, what happens if somebody can disrupt what the producers are reading? Well, we have reasons to believe that Putin did that in other Ukrainian elections. We have reasons to believe through their trolling and their ability to tap into computers. If you remember Charlottesville, you had white nationalists demonstrating, right? And then you had people demonstrating against the white nationalists, okay? Now they discover through Facebook's either inability or lack of interest in paroling what's on their site, that these chat rooms spread up. And these chat rooms, are you going to allow the white nationalists to take over Charlottesville, go out there and stop the fascists? And then you have at the same time, do you believe that Jews and blacks should get everything? We have to fight for our country and the white nation. And a lot of these things are being traced to similar sources. We think these sources are at least trolls of Russia. And they've done that in Europe. They've done that. We had the Orange Revolution in Eastern Europe for a while. Again, it's disinformation. It's spreading lies. It's spreading chaos, disruption. The Nazis did that with less technological skill. Russians, we have a little more sophisticated now. That's kind of what he writes about. How do they do this? How do they destroy parties, institutions? The other thing is, well, I'll get back to you. Are we a violent species? Okay. The Founding Fathers thought we were, as Madison and others would say. What other species, most other species, they kill for self-preservation, they kill for food. All right? We're the only species that is given a brain to think, leaves behind great art, great music, great architecture. Yet we have found all these other reasons to kill people for. We kill them over religion, we kill them over politics, we kill them over race, we go right down the line. So yeah, the most violent critter on earth. So what about a system, is mankind good or evil? Well, it's evil. Let's look at the Bible, let's talk about the fall of Adam and all of that. So Madison comes up with, when you hear this word Madisonian democracy, let's think of what I'm talking about. Madison comes up with, you got two choices. Man is a beast, mankind is a beast, and you have to stop this impulse from coming out. So we have one big gulag. Everybody's in their place. Everything's nice and quiet, orderly, and that's the end of that. Well, the problem is, what happens to creativity? How do you make medical advances? What do you do about the impulses that create an Einstein or a Mozart? What do you do about this? How do you let the good come out without the evil dominating? So you divide power. So the United States is a very special place. I'm not waving a flag. I'm not. But you say, look, the king decides, the dictator, no. We say power is too dangerous to put in one hand. So we have three branches of government. We have these checks and balances. No one told me about that. He thinks he can veto a constitutional amendment. Said it, right? Constitutional amendment passed in 1865. If he wants to say that people born in the United States are not native citizens, he can just do it. Well, the whole purpose of a constitution is to limit power. You go to an independence home. The whole purpose is to limit what they can't do. Negative, right? You can't pass a law to establish religion, right? You must have a jury trial. Or you can't deprive people of life, liberty without a jury trial. And so the first 10 amendments are negative power. Congress shall pass no law. Well, we take an oath. I've taken an oath many times, and we take an oath to the Constitution, not to the Führer. Right? So last week, we have an award called, I'm not calling him a fascist, I'm calling him an ignoramus. Difference. Right? And I'm also not calling him stupid, because you can cure ignorance. I mean, Well, not this time, but all right, you can. But he decides that we have an award called the Presidential Medal of Freedom. We created it to honor our great people in this country who are worthy of emulation and worthy of honor. People like Jonas Salk and the polio vet, people like Leonard Bernstein, we're talking about great people. And he decides it's the President's Award. So therefore, he just gave it to the wife of one of his largest financial contributors. Now it says President's Award. He turns these things out like toys in our name, right? So maybe he does think that we take the oath to him, not to the Constitution. Well, that's certainly what we've seen in other lands, that there's no difference between the temporary occupant and the country. Lincoln made clear it's temporary. Well, maybe he thinks something about it one day too, but that's what I'm talking about. So we start taking the oath to the person and not to the document. So what else did fascists do in the 1930s? And by the way, it's not just the fascists, communists do it too. One of the great joys of the United States, foreigners keep telling us, the famous one was de Tocqueville, comes to the United States in the Jacksonian era. Mm-hmm. What is it about this people? We got this, town in the middle of nothing, and the train stops, and before you know, you got 6 people. You have a public library, you have a Boy Scout troop, you have a symphony, you have a 4-H club. These are mediating institutions. That's where most of our civil life takes place. To quote Mrs. Thatcher, free trade exists when there's not a government minister in the room. And you want to sell me donuts, that's great. You don't have anybody from London saying, 2 cents for me. I mean, that's called freedom. And so they go after the intermediary institutions. If you strip down the intermediary institutions, there's nothing between the ordinary citizen and the government. And my hero is Edmund Burke, because he believed that that's what most social life should exist outside of the state. And outside of whoever the president is, civilian life will continue. Norman Rockwell, the great paintings of the New England Town Meeting, right? Boy, talk about art and winning the war. And talk about bureaucrats being idiots. We had these 4 Norman Rockwell recruiting posters at the end. And you didn't have to, as the caissons were rolling through Europe, liberating country after country at the end, you didn't have to know a word of English to know what they were about. Freedom of speech, the one, the farmer in New England. Right? Freedom of religion, which they brought out again after 9/11. Actually had Muslims and Hindi, and not just Jews, Catholics, and Protestants, and everything else was in that. Freedom from fear, the couple tucking in their children at night without fear of bombing. And then you'll see the other one, freedom from want, Grandma for the Turkey, which you'll all see next week. And it's been parodied a great deal. I mean, that was America toward the end. I mean, that was also the most hollowed out, bombed out store in God knows where had these things hanging. So the artist, I love this story, Mr. Rockwell, says, well, I'm too old for this war. I've done my thing in the last one, but why don't I take these sketches and send them to government? So they tell him that, no, we've only gone to commercial artists. We don't waste our time with magazine illustrators like you. Thank you, but no thank you. Okay, so he sells it to the Saturday Evening Post for about $1 million. And, you get magazines, they have these labels on them. So one of the subscribers was F.D. Roosevelt, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And it gets the Saturday Evening Post. They bring it on his breakfast tray with his scrambled eggs and his New York Times. And he sees the cover. He goes, who is this guy? This is fantastic. Get him on the phone. So the White House switchboard, very good. They get anybody in the world. And he gets this guy in Strawbridge, Massachusetts on the phone, and was passed out when he heard who he was talking to. And he says, I want them for the war effort. Mr. President, we have two problems. I think I can solve them both. What do you mean we have a problem? He said, well, I offered them to the War Department, and they declined. What? You know, get that idiot general down here. They declined. And he said, but the Saturday Evening Post is a very patriotic magazine. I'm sure you can have the rights without $1 million. Right? You know the rest of it. But I mean, yeah, stupidity. But that says it all, doesn't it? And I don't know. I think it takes a long time to destroy trust. I think it's too bad that I get so many notes of sympathy from people abroad. I mean, I'm not talking about jingoism, but they're used to looking to us for some inspiration or some ideas or some helping hand, so anything. Instead, I get these notes from many of the friends of mine in Britain, like, what the hell's wrong with him? And why is he the only one who doesn't see any of this? And it's very troubling. But they know what's going on. The big problem is if this takes hold. That's why he wrote this book. If it takes hold, if the bad forces that were set up unleashed, not necessarily by him. You can't blame him for everything. What I described with Putin was around long before him. And this going after democratic institutions and subtly undermining, trying to rebuild what they can of the Soviet empire without the Red Army. That's been going on long before. Anger from the provinces, what's going on in Hungary. When I went to Hungary when George Herbert Walker Bush was president, you weren't born yet, you told me already. Anyway, when I went there, they told me this young kid named Urban. He said, you're of the Vietnam era? Yeah. He said, this Urban is a student leader. He's the kind of kid who would have knocked on your door to vote for Gene McCarthy in New Hampshire to end the Vietnam War. And he's been demonstrating against the Russians since he was in college. He's the biggest fascist in Europe now. I mean, he used to go to George Soros, and then you might have heard of, for money to set up dissident organization and found student groups. And then at his invitation, Soros started Central Eastern European University, which is going to be an Oxford for Eastern Europe. And he just kicked him out. He just made him leave the country because he doesn't like the criticism of the Hungarian government now. Why is this going on? It's nothing to do with Trump. Now, maybe he's cashing in on it, or maybe they're finding a new leader, but nothing to do with Trump. Things are happening in the world I don't quite understand. But the Congress of Vienna kept the peace for 50 years. NATO and to some extent the EU have kept things solvent for at least that long. And I don't know what's going to take its place. I don't know why we're trying to unravel it, but it doesn't go.
I just have a question. Something just
Yeah,
popped
please.
into my head.
Yeah.
Going back to your earlier
Yeah.
discussion about fascism, I guess in light of a lot of things that have happened lately, is a white nationalist essentially a fascist?
That's a hard call, isn't it? Well, to quote Mrs.
Because a lot
Thatcher,
of people kind of throw that word around.
well, let's talk.
Yeah.
To quote Mrs. Thatcher again, and our Constitution. Our Constitution doesn't say you have to be white to be a citizen, although it clearly was understood because non-whites were pretty much not citizens before the Civil War. But after the Civil War, it said anyone born in the United States shall have all the rights of the Constitution extended to them. I don't have the exact language here. Didn't say why. A lot of anger from displaced, downwardly mobile, okay? White people or working people, what do you call it, who are resentful in a way that they see the demography of the country changing. They see more minorities. They hear about affirmative action for African Americans or Hispanics, for women, and they argue nothing's been done for them. What about us, right? We're losing our country. What do they mean? They mean that there were more whites in the country. They mean you go back to 1950 or 55 and what was on television, Leave It to Beaver. There were no non-whites in the cast, right? We don't like to talk about the great disgrace of Bill Cosby, but before he came along, he deserves everything he's getting now. But when he came along, he was the first African American in a detective situation. I Spy was the show. The first time African American was the good guy, the detective stopping crime and not the criminal. First time. And he mainstreamed black family life, the black middle class, that you can't have black middle class through his comedy. He's a demon, deserves what he's getting. But before he came along, never saw an African American out of Lucy, and think this was their culture, and they don't see, or they see less of themselves in their culture. Are they fascist? I don't know. They have legitimate concerns. There are parts of this country that were left out, no question about it. I remember hearing speeches, hearing governors and mayors so happy that we've lost our manufacturing base, that we're all service economy. Really, we're going to be burger flippers. I mean, isn't that marvelous? I heard governors say this, and you can get on a train in New York City and go up to Canada through Buffalo. You'll swear this is Berlin after the war. I mean, except no one bombed them. I mean, it's real estate after real estate, boarded up glass, empty factories. How can that be? And several New York governors have tried to jumpstart through tax incentives and other things. It never seems to happen. They have a legitimate set of concerns. And what I don't understand, you're sitting in a state that made Donald Trump president. And
those people elected him.
well, I'm telling you, yes.
He had a populist agenda that
Well,
promised them things.
yeah, I'm telling you that Hillary Clinton's great attempt to win the presidency was to have Springsteen and Beyonce and everybody else come to Philadelphia. And there were 3 or 4 counties in the West, and Erie County is one of them, and Lackawanna County is another one, I can name a third one, where they haven't seen anybody campaign for years. And those are the counties that pulled Pennsylvania away from her. I don't understand it. That used to be the backbone of the Democratic Party when I was mentioning Franklin Roosevelt. I mean, he talked about the ordinary American common man. And all that. That's what he was talking about. He was hating Wall Street. He hated Chestnut Street and other places. But how could they lose? I don't understand that. She did one good thing, which I don't understand why she never came back to it. You want to talk about Trump having a legitimate argument? These 2 Princeton professors found that all the great economic success we've had since the 60s, one group stubbornly not only doesn't make progress, but is falling back. And they're uneducated or undegreed, let's put it that way. No college, undegreed white people. And they have the lowest life expectancy. In other words, we brought up African Americans, we brought up people out of poverty, we've done a lot of things right. They're going downward. And these 2 people won a Nobel for their research. Hillary mentioned it once. She put it on her website once. She was right when she said maybe what we have to do is be less dependent on coal. I mean, keep saying how coal's coming back. Yeah, so at the age of 39, you're going to have black lung and you're going to die, right? Or the coal mine is going to collapse on you, and the whole world will stop. While we watched, Governor Manchin fighting with the corrupt coal companies in West Virginia trying to get help, right? We know that's going to happen, and that's the best he's offering them. So when she got near it, she mentioned it to professors, put it on her website, never went to the place where it could matter, and come up with anything. But at least he never talked about it. Still didn't talk about it. Would he want his grandchildren to be coal miners? I mean, so are they fascists? I don't know. They have legitimate grievances. They will tell you they're not. They will tell you they're not prejudiced. They will tell you that they don't want to take things away from anyone else. They just feel that their needs haven't been addressed. Maybe.
Yeah.
You want to go back and look. The New York Times sent 2 reporters out. One, Richard Cohen was one, and Timothy Egan was the other. And they sent one to Ohio, and they sent one to Pennsylvania, and they went to these Trump counties. And they say, may we talk to you, this is anecdotal, so you don't know, Paul, can we talk to you a little bit? We saw a Trump sign in your driveway. Yeah. Well, are you upset about immigrants? Why am I upset about immigrants? There are no immigrants here, and there are no jobs for anybody. I mean, Hispanics aren't taking our jobs. There ain't no jobs, right? When Obama was elected, my copay for my then health plan was about $200 a month. With Obamacare, you know, she comes up to $700 a month. You know, I have a son on opioid addiction, and I have a husband who's got cancer. Things got worse under Obama, at least financially for us. She said, I'm telling you what she said. I'm not making a judgment. No, I don't think that's racist or fascist. I think she's saying, when are we going to get some attention?
Yeah.
That's what I'm hearing.
And I'm just wondering if there's a connection between that kind of sense of being forgotten and turning to, you know, white supremacy and that kind of stuff.
Well, this is it. I mean,
I think that, yeah.
What happened in Charlottesville has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. I mean, the idea that, well, no, the idea that these idiots, or whatever they are, on the internet, get this message that, I don't know how many of you have been in Charlottesville. It's at the foot of the Appalachians, beautiful area. Even by our standards, Charlottesville is not a depressed inner city, even though it has majority population.
Isn't there a university?
Yeah, it's University of Virginia, but I mean, the city itself is largely African American, but it's not Newark. I mean, it's not what we know. And this peaceful village, that Jefferson helped design, they're having a big argument about whether they're going to, a municipal council is having an argument among themselves whether they're going to take down a Memorial Rugby League. We won't even get into that. And then every skinhead in America, on a Facebook page or a chat room, is told, here's the place to make a stand. And all these overweight white guys with short hair and khaki pants and white shirts, whatever the hell that's supposed to do, show up in this little town. Invade the town carrying these torches and screaming, you know, Jews will not replace us. None of them live there. And then the other side, this is what we're talking about with the Russian maybe. The other side comes out to protest it. The guy weaponizes the car and a woman's dead. That's not get us jobs, please. That's not deal with my opioid son. I mean, this is wacky.
It's different.
It's nuts. So a friend of mine, a student of mine, well, we had an incident at Penn because, you know, Facebook is named for the freshman handbook, right? So I want to get to meet people, right? I want to meet boys, a boy to go out with, I want to meet a girl to go out with, I want to meet a friend to talk to, and you get to see, well, it has your picture, right? And it says where you're from, right? Oh, I went to that school, that kind of business. Well, somehow they got a copy of that, and they started sending all kinds of nasty, threatening notes to African American students. That's what I'm saying, it was the big issue. So a student of mine said, well, were we better off when these gutter snipes were underground? Or are we better off now that they feel emboldened to come out in the open? I said, of course we're better off with them underground. Of course we were better off before. There was a sense of social sanction. They knew that certain things aren't going to be tolerated. Yeah. But if you're going to show up and you're going to find, you know, 300 people like you screaming the same thing in Virginia, you're going to feel emboldened. Yeah. To what extent can a president's words inflame? I think a lot. To what extent can they soothe and calm? I think a lot. I didn't want to just make the whole class about Trump, so I gave them 4 speeches other presidents gave in similar times. I gave them the speech Bill Clinton gave after the Oklahoma City bombing. I I gave them Reagan's speech after the Challenger, right, about the sterling bonds of earth touch the face of God. I mean, and telling, first of all, we had this 5th grade teacher who's going to be an astronaut, so we asked all the school children to watch,
Yeah.
and they got to watch that horror.
Yeah.
So what do you tell young people? Well, you tell them it's still worth taking a chance, it's still worth doing better, it's still worth going forward. He did it, and he had very little time to do that because he was on right away because the kids were watching and it was like horror.
Yeah.
And what else? I gave them Obama at Charleston. And I had 1 or 2 others, but I mean, they get the message. He doesn't speak this way. He doesn't think that's his role. And I find it very frustrating, but I'm not completely negative about it. I think we need to address some of these issues. So those of you from other countries, do you really think I'm crazy? I mean, you kind of wonder, I would wonder a little bit.
We have our own problems.
You do. And,
Spiritual
and I'm going to ask you, so you have your problems. You've had this Brexit thing for a while. You've had a rise of anti-Semitism in both the left and the right, correct?
Yes.
And you've had like 5 generations or more of people in Britain on British passports who don't think they're British or wind up in ISIS training camps, even though they're a member of the local cricket club and right, remember that, right? Whatever. The guy who bombed the London Underground was a member of a whitewater rafting club and Leeds or something, and is willing to. Yeah, you have your problems, right? So how is it going over there?
Well, what's interesting coming over here, I think, is how insignificant our little island is compared to what everyone thinks. I mean, when you're there, these things are overwhelming, the way that, and the same way that they are here. But when you're, I feel like the problems here on like an international level are so much more significant than I don't know. It seems like it's like a toy compared to the States a little bit.
It's still dangerous.
Of course it is, yeah, I know. But I think that's terrible as well.
What's going to happen with Brexit? You know what Brexit is, right? Yeah.
I mean, well, it's unprecedented. No one knows what's going on. No one seems to have any idea how to sort it out. It's just been dragging on. I have an inkling that maybe in 5 years or so everyone will just forget about it. But that's my hope.
Well,
Might very well happen.
it would be nice. It looks like they're coming to a conclusion of it, of course.
Well, they have this deadline. But,
Yes,
yeah.
they have a 2-year deadline.
So.
Well, I think we'll call it quits.
Okay.
I did have one, actually I had 2 things that I wanted to bring up, but I don't think I'll bring them up, but
No,
let me
no.
bring them up.
All right.
I did want to ask you or mention the word populism,
Yes.
because you mentioned it earlier.
Yes.
And I think there is a kind of a crisis in, you could call it a cultural crisis, if you will, in the arts, and I think particularly in classical music. And this is a huge debate and a huge argument. Most people think that classical music is some kind of elitist art form. I don't agree, and I think that the history of music shows that it wasn't necessarily like that. And I think that in the modern age, it has kind of turned into a kind of intellectual or elitist thing. And I'm very much against that. And the reason why we're doing this, and others, is to try to restore a line of communication, I think, with the middle class or the average person. And actually during the 19th century, music had become more or less the province of the bourgeois, the
Yes.
wealthy middle class. And it was alive and well and functioning very much like it had been functioning in the 17th century, 18th century, with its patrons, whether it was a church or kings or whatever. And so that was a major shift in the 19th century.
Yes.
But somehow it seems that basically after World War I and the devastating effect in the cultural circles in Europe, it became or retreated, I think, into a kind of intellectual process. And I think that came right on through to the 20th century, and I think it's had a negative influence on the importance and the value of so-called classical music.
Yes.
And so I have used in my own classes the term populism. I think that one of the things that musicians trained today need to have a kind of line to the average American or average people, and in that way make music be more, there's more relationship between the world and the artists. And I think that art always has some kind of relationship that way in what it wants to, things that we want to see represented. That's a Hickey statement. Rather than what we want to see, we want to see those things represented. It's what we want to see represented. And so I just want to, I don't think that's the kind of populism that is circulating in the world today and that's generally associated with the political environment here. Is it?
Well, it depends where we go for one's inspiration. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the word populist in the sense that should elites decide, and is it better because it's coming down from on top, or should people decide? It's very populist to say that workers should have a say over what they make, what we produce, and what the working conditions are. I mean, you have a better company, you have happier, more productive workers. Should all the decisions be made by 5 or 6 companies? Markets are very populist, right?
Well,
command economies say all women are wearing brown shoes this year, and we say, well, let's see what the market wants to do.
well, I do think marketing has an important feature, and I think it is kind of ingrained in a certain sense in the American way. And I think that marketing is important, but I also feel, well, you touch on something that I think directly relates to the music world.
Yes.
Should the success or failure of an artwork be reflected in the opinions of the people, or should it fall in the responsibilities of the people who organize the music world, or in critics, or so forth? And what is the value? It's David Hickey's point that the art market that grew up in the 60s and the 70s was really governed by the people who wanted to buy art, or who wanted to invest in it. And it was much more broadly, the spectrum was much wider.
Well, it shocked me when I found out, thanks to our tax code and our lack of cultural policy, that people actually do sculptures to be exhibited in museum. The idea would be the museums will buy them. I mean, I used to think, well, this is the great Houdin bust of Washington, and the museum bought it to display it. I never thought the idea that we're going to produce contemporary art and have some donor just buy it, give it to a museum, and take tax deduction. That's a big shock to me. So that's sort of having the museum curators and the donors decide the cultural policy for the country, and not the artists.
Well, that's one thing I'm questioning.
Yes.
Right. Not a very popular idea, I don't think.
But I would say, you know,
My idea.
well, what is a well educated man or woman? Well, in the earlier decades, particularly immigrant families from Europe, you know, the poorest family had a violin in the house. And that's how you become a gentleman, or a lady, or a flute, or anything else. The German tradition, the German Jewish tradition, Polish tradition, is very much alive. To some extent, not all, most of, but a very large number of the state competitions in band and in orchestra and opera are being won by Asian American students, all state bands and orchestras, and you start looking at the younger casts in various productions. So there's a sense even that immigrant culture is keeping it alive. But you know, attitudes change. But then somebody comes along and says, you know, we're going to use rap lyrics to teach the Constitution. And Hamilton becomes the biggest hit, you know, in a genre that young students, African American students, can understand in a way that talks about aspiration for them. The only white guy in Hamilton production is George III, isn't it? I mean, but it works. That they're using that play to say you can be Hamilton. He came from nothing. You should do your homework. I mean, they had the first song with that was auditioned at a White House concert with the Obamas. I don't even know if the song made the final Hamilton, but it was a man with nothing from the Caribbean. And the truth is, we know very little about the real Hamilton. We know very little about who his mother was, and it was Nueves in the Caribbean. And it's working.
Well, I think that's an example of something that exists in, you know, in a kind of folk element or in
Yes.
average culture that has made it into some kind of art form like that. It's been transformed or used in a different way for.
But it's not your conventional
Southern art.
white guy in a powdered wig. It's not Williamsburg. I mean,
No,
it's
yes.
relevant to where they are.
Yes, but I wonder, is it possible to heal or kind of create a better intersection between what's actually going on and this so-called classical musical world? I don't like that term anyway, but for lack of a better term, what's classical about it? Is it original? You know, that's really what that word means. But is there a way to do that? And that's what I'm asking. And so in that sense, I don't think the word populism is a bad thing. I think that by being aware of what's going on and really thinking about it and trying to brainstorm and come up with ways in which that gap can be bridged is important. But that's all I have to contribute. And I just, on behalf of Curtis and this wonderful group of colleagues here, I want to thank you for talking to us today.
Thank you. Well, I wish you a wonderful holiday and great success of the semester and beyond, and great auditions and great opportunities as you move on. Thank you.
Thank you
so much.
very, very much.
Thanks for coming.
I teach political communications and in the Annenberg School of Communications, and we've had a very good semester. Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank
I
you.
really enjoyed it.
Thank you for thinking about these issues.
Of course. Yeah, it's but, thank you for talking.
Hey Clara, would you like to, this your t-shirt?
Would you like to?
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
No problem.
Good luck to you.
Thank you so